a little bit, keep me awake, and see how we get on. Remind me, who here is from Thomas More? Right, okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about More this morning, as well as Fisher and some of the other Northern humanists. What can you tell me about your patron?
He was an English humanist.
Okay.
The son of a prominent lawyer. I think he grew up for a time in the court of Archbishop Morello, and then studied law at Oxford.
Can everyone hear this? No? Okay. So, Northern humanist, yeah? Studied law. Do you know where he lived when he was studying law? He lived at the Charterhouse. He lived with the Carthusians. I don't know if you're familiar with the Carthusian order, but it's a strange order because they combine the monastic life of living together with the eremitical life to live like a hermit. And so it's a very you could say it's a very serious vocation, right? It's for the tough, and these are the conditions that More chose while he studied law, and he decided to do that because he was discerning whether to join religious life or not. And when he decided not to join religious life, but to go into the profession of being a lawyer, and then ultimately became a politician. But prior to that, when he went into law, he asked himself, who can be an exemplar of the holy layman? He had become accustomed to thinking about the Christian life in terms of wearing a habit and praying the office and celebrating the Holy Mass and so forth. And so he asked himself, who could be the exemplar for living as a holy layperson? And do you know who he came up with? This is where we can switch to the Italians. Pico della Mirandola. I know it's not convincing, and you don't have to agree with More, but this is the person whom he came up with. Go on.
This is really odd to me because his life with Pico is not that complimentary.
Right. Well, this is one of the strange. I mean, I would disagree with you. Are you saying that Pico is not an exemplar objectively, or are you saying that he's not complimentary about Pico?
Just my memory of the book, I remember him not being that complimentary of Pico. Maybe I was reading it more ironically than I should have. But.
Well, that's not to my reading. He is very aware of the moral flaws of Pico. Do you know that Pico ran off with Lorenzo de' Medici's sister-in-law? No? That was an interesting episode. And Lorenzo's brother wanted to kill Pico. And Lorenzo had to step in, because Lorenzo actually really appreciated Pico being around in his court and didn't want him dead. So he had to step in and convince his brother to leave him alone. So certainly Pico had his shortcomings, but it's worth a rereading. Every single chapter is about Pico's devotion to the study of scripture, to the study of philosophy, to his prayer. He translates the spiritual exercises of Pico, which are actually added at the end of this book. So at least the explanation that More gives for having written it is for this reason. I don't see why we shouldn't take him at face value. But anyway, we can have a discussion. At the same time, you have Fisher, who becomes the great bishop of Rochester, sets up St. John's College in Cambridge with the help of a wealthy patroness, and he radically changes the curriculum. And this is what I was trying to get at yesterday, when he starts to synthesize principles of the new learning, the Italian Renaissance, and starts to reintroduce a study of the liberal arts, whilst not doing away with scholastic studies. And this is one of the points that I was trying to tease out yesterday. What's really interesting about Moore and Fisher is that they very much rely on this distinction between the Via Moderna and the Via Antica. Someone to read on this is a Cambridge historian called Richard Rex, who's written a lot on John Fisher and John Fisher's theology, and really develops this idea that the Via Antica and the Via Moderna these terms are a way of separating the later manualist tradition of scholasticism, which they worry is based on skepticism about metaphysics. You remember we discussed this yesterday, these sort of logical extrapolations and logical formulae. And they go back to the original texts, particularly of Aquinas. And there are some really interesting moments, for example, in the confutation of Tyndale's answer by Thomas More, when he's responding to Tyndale. And one of the things he takes exception to is that Luther has referred to Henry VIII as a Thomist, as if this is a pejorative term. And More doesn't buy this view at all. More will use the word scholastic as a pejorative term to mean something quite specific, but he doesn't agree with the use of the word Thomist in this way. Because he's trying to revive this notion of the Via Antica. Now, I think what they're aiming at is the notion that if certain strands of humanism, particularly the emphasis on rhetoric, is based on a skepticism about the possibility of conveying truth, and so is the later scholasticism, although they turn to logic as opposed to rhetoric. It seems to me that what More and Fisher are getting at is the notion that if you synthesize the old scholastic method of Aquinas, and you synthesize that with rhetorical principles coming out of the new learning, then you can actually revive this kind of Ciceronian principle that rhetoric can be placed at the service of truth in order to illustrate the beauty of truth, or the truth of what you're saying is more apparent by the beauty with which you convey it. Let's put it that way. And it seems to me that, and again, we can go back to Pico and see what More really thinks of him, but it seems to me interesting that the two ways in which Luther approaches, I suppose you could say, a kind of theological anthropology, is that he says that man isn't really rational in in the way that we would understand man to be rational. Right? And of course this is based in a kind of skepticism, like we were talking about yesterday, that's arisen from his studies of nominalism. Man isn't really rational in the way that we would understand man to be rational, so the certainty that man can place is in an act of faith in revelation. And of course the reason for this is Luther's understanding of what's taking place at the fall. It's not merely that man has been wounded, it is that man has been destroyed, or what Calvin will later call total corruption. And so if you're going to have any certainty, because when you turn to nature you're turning into a destroyed abyss, if you're going to have any certainty by way to navigate through life, you have to turn to God's revelation exclusively. And this is not a rational assent to revelation, because it's not presupposed by what we would call the preambula fide. Right? So Catholics would always say something like, well, if you're going to say that God has revealed himself in history, then you first have to say that God exists. And if you're going to say that, then you have to have arguments. That would be the kind of way that Catholics would traditionally do that. Luther wouldn't buy an argument like that at all. So man is not really rational, and man isn't free. And Luther has some wonderful quotes to describe his position here, which you may be familiar with. One of the more famous ones is, quote, "Man is like a horse." Have you come across this before? Luther says, "Man is like a horse. God does leap into the saddle. The horse is obedient and accommodates itself to every movement of the rider and goes whither he wills it. Does God throw down the reins? Then Satan leaps upon the back of the animal, which bends and goes and submits to the spurs of its new rider. Therefore, necessity," this is how he concludes, "therefore necessity, not free will, is the controlling principle of our conduct. God is the author of what is evil, as well as what is good. And as he bestows happiness on those who merit it not, so also does he damn others who deserve not their fate." Now, this is kind of shocking to us, but this comes from the later Luther, and part of the problem is, of course, that I think over 2 decades beforehand, Erasmus had already written his work on the freedom of the will to respond to Luther's anthropology, and had kind of pushed Luther into a corner here and said, well, if you're going to say this, you also have to say this, this, and this. And so, if you look at Luther's writings, what you can trace is that God becomes more and more responsible for everything that's evil in the world, and man becomes less and less responsible, becomes more and more a kind of brutish type figure. And I'm not convinced that this was Luther's initial proposition, but they kind of back him into this corner until... Sorry, do you want to say something?
I had a question, but you can finish.
Oh, go ahead.
I had a kind of just a question, because when we were studying Luther last year, we talked a lot about his anthropology and the way he has such a stark divide between the body and the soul.
Sure.
And I was just wondering how this idea of free will relates to that divide. If he's going to kind of portray man's spirit as like wholly good in a way, if it's saved, then how does the free will fit?
Luther says that man's spirit is wholly good. Is that what you're saying?
I guess that's not quite right, but just if, like, the body is holding down man's spirit, correct? And
But Luther
spirit
wouldn't
is
say
here to
that.
No?
Luther wouldn't. Both the spirit and the body are equally corrupt in Luther's theology. So this, you know, this famous phrase that I've actually never been able to find this in Luther's writings, but it's quoted all the time. That grace is like snow falling upon dung. Have you heard this before?
Heard it.
Right? So this notion that you have this this totally corrupt human person, and grace is kind of covering over this and making it acceptable to God, right? But you enter heaven with all that corruption. So there's no bond of charity in the way that we would understand it between man and God. It is that in some way Christ's redemption merely covers over and makes us acceptable before God. And of course it sounds kind of pious because he's saying, look, it's you're totally rotten. This is all Christ's work, right? So he's trying to protect the sovereignty of Christ in that way. But it's not. I mean, we would say, wouldn't we, that following the Augustinian notion that original sin has, in some way, a material efficient causation, and therefore we can say that the defect in the body due to original sin implies a certain effect on our rationality and a darkening of our mind and so forth. Luther's not going to give you that. The whole of the human person is corrupt. And fine, he might maintain a certain anthropological dualism because of his Augustinian training, and Augustine is does not have a hylomorphic anthropology. He has a Neoplatonist anthropology. But it doesn't really matter for Luther. The whole human person, both body and soul, are corrupt due to original sin. Well, because you have this humanist notion of the dignity of man, as Pico will put it, this sounds really repugnant to the Renaissance thinkers, to those who are receiving the humanist thinking, and who are interpreting it in that way. And certainly to Moore and Fisher, and Erasmus, but he interprets things a little bit differently. So, okay, well, let's go back to that, because I just want to say what follows on from the anthropology into the political sphere, because it's worth reflecting on. There was a question that we ended on yesterday about what the notion of the relationship between church and state lends itself more to an Aristotelian conception of the human person. Yeah, have I got that right? As opposed to the Platonism that's entering the academy and so forth. So, I think you're right. It does, and the explanation I think I would give to this is that those who are furthering the model of the relationship between church and state as being comparable or analogous to the relationship between body and soul are initially, at least, it's based in the Salamancan school. And the Salamancan school, so the first person who starts developing this is Vittoria, Francisco de Vittoria. This is taken up in a really big way by Suarez, and then the person who really develops it is Bellarmine. And what I want to come to in a moment, actually, is that there is Bellarmine and Thomas More don't entirely agree on the relationship between church and state. But the Salamancan school is resisting the introduction of Plato into the philosophy faculties. So when you look particularly at Vittoria, he is constantly going to Aristotle. And so I think that this conception of church and state, which then goes throughout Europe, particularly because Vittoria is extremely influential on the King of Spain, who's also Charles V, who's also the Holy Roman Emperor. This kind of political thought spreads throughout Europe. But you're absolutely right, it's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition over the Platonic tradition. I don't know if that's helpful. So I think, so in terms of the way that we understand the Reformation as well as the humanist revival on the political sphere, I think one of the things that Moore is really, really worried about, and I don't know how many of you have read the dialogue concerning heresies. Is this known to any of you? This is really worth reading. C.S. Lewis called it the finest Platonic dialogue ever written in English. You know, if you get really into 16th century works of philosophy, you often find that a lot of it is not, it's interesting, but it's not really entertaining. But this is really entertaining. This is it may be hard to believe, but it's a kind of page turner. And it's a discussion between Thomas More and a young Oxford student who is considering becoming a Lutheran and apostatizing, effectively. And one of the things that comes out throughout this dialogue, time and time again, is that More worries that the student is being manipulated. And he thinks that part of the problem with the new Lutheran doctrine is that it's not the religion of the people. And this comes out very strongly in the dialogue. He wouldn't use this term, but it comes out that he sees the Reformation as a kind of social engineering or a kind of social manipulation. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, this is a really interesting dialogue for assessing how More is applying Aristotelian or Thomistic principles as well. I'll give you an example. Quite early on in the dialogue, they have a discussion about the use of images in churches and for piety. Because the student has been reading about some of the Protestant sects appearing on the continent who are iconoclasts, who are destroying the statues and the images of those. And he gives the classic argument that this is a good thing because these are examples of idolatry. And what More starts to argue is that what he says to the student, look, when you think about Jesus and you go to meditate and pray and you think about Jesus, even if you just say the name of Jesus, presumably you get a kind of image in your mind of a scene in the life of Christ. And when you have that image in your mind, presumably that moves the affects of the will, and you are inflamed with a kind of love for him. And this image is helping this devotion, or this sense of devotion, Reformation developed. And he says, but you know that the image in your mind is not itself Jesus, and you know that even though it's causing you to be devoted to Jesus, you are not actually worshipping the image in your mind. And what Moore is basically doing is he's drawing on on certain epistemological principles in Aquinas on how the will and the intellect operate in relation to the phantasmata of the imagination. So that's quite interesting. So anyway, to go back, so he's really worried that there's a sort of social manipulation taking place. And there are various reasons for this. Moore points out, for example, that how can this be the religion of the people? Because obviously the argument is we need to get the scriptures into the hands of the people. And Moore is saying, well, how can the principle of sola scriptura, or of the scriptures alone, be beneficial for a predominantly illiterate population? So in order to know that they are receiving the scriptures, and in order to know that they're receiving a good translation of the scriptures, and again, Moore argues that very few translations, if any, are actually accurate, and that words are deliberately changed, and he accuses Tyndale of this. Words are deliberately changed in order to bend the doctrine. A well-known example is Tyndale, instead of translating the word ecclesia into church, he translates it into congregation. Right? A typical example of trying to say, well, no, the church is where the local people gather. It's not an appeal to the authority established by Christ, something like that. So, in order to trust that you're getting a good translation, because even if you can read, you probably can't read Greek, that's why you want the translation in vernacular in the first place, you're still having to put your trust in a kind of newly established intelligentsia. And your faith is completely dependent on that. And as Moore points out in this work, it's not clear where their authority comes from in the first place. It's not like turning to the apostles. Turning to Tyndale is not like turning to the apostles. At the same time, what is the primary way by which the predominantly illiterate population is being catechized at this time? Images. The statues, the catechetical art, the frescoes, and so forth. All of which are being destroyed. So Moore sees this really as an attempt at political manipulation of the plebeian sphere. He also thinks that we learn through gestures, that we learn through liturgical actions, for example. That all of these things, like crossing yourself and genuflecting and so on, that not so much Luther is attacking, but other Protestant thinkers are attacking, are ways in which we actually learn the faith. He also thinks that Luther's anthropology is an attack on the political engagement of the masses. That this notion of man being an irrational brute who does not actually have freedom of determination over his own actions, in a way opens up the possibility for a really draconian, a really hard attitude toward people. And this comes out quite strongly, actually, in Luther's response to the German peasants' revolt, the Great Peasants' Revolt. Because Luther really wants the leaders to crush the kind of rise of this brutish people. And this reoccurs afterwards, over and over again, within Protestant currents of political philosophy. Most obvious being someone like Hobbes, right? Where you need this strong draconian leader to overcome these irrational, brutish people that if they're not in a constant state of fear, they'll all be kind of tearing each other apart like rabid dogs. Right? This is about as far as you can get from Aristotle's notion of the polity being a kind of rational participation in what it truly is to be a human being. Families coming together, forming a conglomeration of families, setting up a political authority, this kind of rational way of living as a fruitful person. This is about as far as you can get from this idea. There are some lovely quotes about the Great Peasants' Revolt from Luther. I particularly like this one. Peasants are no better than straw. They will not hear the word, and they are without sense. Therefore they must be compelled to hear the crack of the whip and the whiz of the bullets, and it is only what they deserve. This was a response to the Great Peasants' Revolt. Like the drivers of donkeys who have to belabour the donkeys incessantly with rods and whips, or they will not obey, so must the ruler do with the people. They must drive and beat and throttle and hang and burn and behead and torture, so as to make themselves feared and to keep the people in check. End quote. So it's quite clear about his position.
If all humans are not totally depraved, as Calvin's term, corrupted, then does Luther ever explain what gives those who have civil authority their authority?
Yeah, he does, in his exegesis on Romans. Remember, there's no nature, right? Nature's been completely corrupted. So if there's any order, this is because of a direct impact of grace. What we would say is an extraordinary action of grace. He thinks it's all what we would call an extraordinary action of grace. So if someone is in power, that is because God has placed them in that power, but that doesn't itself change the fundamental state of human nature. And so God has providentially placed him in that position of power precisely to subdue the kind of ways that humans will naturally behave.
So is there ever such a thing as questioning authority or the abuse of power?
Not yet. Not until you get to the French Revolution, which is a kind of extension of many Reformation principles.
Right. Because, for instance, the Anabaptists, right, did that probably even more severely than the Lutherans.
Yeah.
But Luther was really critical of the Anabaptists.
Yes, exactly. So there are different views that people take. So Tyndale thinks that what you need is a king who cannot be questioned, basically, who will subdue over and over again. Luther doesn't think this. Luther thinks that the kind of Germanic idea of having lots of princes and lesser nobility dotted around, they can form a kind of intelligentsia over the polity. And that they can give the impression to the people that they're free, when actually they need to be working in a manipulative way over the people. So if the people then revolt, that's because the intelligentsia have not done their job properly. They haven't maintained control, which is when you come in really hard. So even in Luther's lifetime, there's a spectrum of exactly what kind of rule follows from the sort of anthropology that you have to accept that presuppose certain Protestant conceptions of revelation. And there's already a diversity of opinion. And this just becomes more and more exaggerated over time. So by the time you get to the establishment of the Quakers by Fox in England, they think that anything that even slightly doesn't resemble a kind of total egalitarianism is anathema. My wife and I used to live in a Quaker village, and the children don't call their parents mum or dad, for example, because that would imply hierarchy. They call them by their first names. So it just becomes more and more exaggerated over time. And it just depends on what you emphasize. It depends on whether you emphasize the anthropological dimension of Protestantism or the ecclesial dimension of Protestantism, which does lend itself to egalitarianism. And that's kind of the problem, because in Protestantism you have these two conflicting visions, a political vision, which is completely anti-egalitarian, and an ecclesial vision, which is almost exclusively egalitarian. Maybe not so much for Luther, but certainly for the other reformers.
It seems it comes full circle, right? Because you end up having Protestant tradition influencing at least the English divine right of kings, where James is really educated in that vein of Protestant kingship.
Yes.
And then over the course of 2 centuries, it comes back to 1688, and then eventually the American conception of that, of back to republicanism. But it's all been influenced by Protestantism. So it feels like it ends up coming full circle.
Well, but the divine right of kings comes a generation later, and that's a little bit different. And it's a little bit different because the people who are formulating the divine right of kings notion, particularly Knox up in Scotland, who's a Calvinist, is doing this predominantly to show how civil authority can be in opposition to papal authority. So the king is actually not just a supreme civil leader, but he's the supreme ecclesiastical leader as well. But this, of course, I mean, we're getting off topic now, but this, of course, is also adopted by Catholics later on. So Bossuet is a perfect example.
Right.
The court of Louis XIV. But it's a little bit different. It comes a generation later when certain Protestant theorists are trying to work out how they're going to respond to papal authority. And the only alternative is to do it through political means. Right, how are we doing? Okay, good. Let's just stop for a moment and see if there are any questions, because I've just been talking. Yeah.
What about the fact that the peasants during the peasant revolts were trying to institute what we would today call communistic principles? Does that justify they're in a fear of their actions?
Why are they communistic principles?
Because they were attempting to overthrow civil authority.
Okay. So you don't mean right. Well, okay, I don't actually think they were trying to overthrow civil authority. I mean, the Great Peasants' Revolt, it it seems clear to me that it starts off as a protest against, as opposed to a revolution. But you don't mean communist principles in terms of subscribing to a materialist cosmology.
No, but just like in terms of a disruption of the current authority, would that not encourage someone who feels that authority should be firm to be very angry at them? I mean, obviously, far too, drastic terms, as you just read this quote, but I could definitely see, specifically at the time, that his sentiment could be valid.
Right. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. I think I think it's based on the intention. Let's put it that way. So for Catholics generally, I think we'd agree that we would want to emphasise the place of civil authority, for example, and for social order, and for this sort of thing. But that's not because we think that human beings are completely corrupt and therefore can't actually operate in a polity without some kind of draconian approach from a civil authority. It's because we think that social order is precisely the expression of human dignity. Right? For Luther, he doesn't subscribe to that kind of anthropology at all. So for Luther, this kind of uprising is when those who have, okay, and you might say, well, this implies free will anyway, but okay, it might not be totally consistent or coherent, but when there's a peasants' revolt, for Luther, it implies that those who are the plebeian, the brute, have slipped out of the control of the intelligentsia. And the intelligentsia are really important for Luther because they're the ones who are actually going to force the new religion onto the population. And that's why, right from the beginning, this idea that people have presented that Protestantism was the work of street preachers going around announcing things to the peasantry, it isn't true at all. Luther went to the princes. He went straight to the princes, and it was imposed from above. And so this kind of civil intelligentsia is really important for Luther, because in a certain sense his entire mission depends on them. There's an interesting quote from the historian Henry Sear that I found. Here we are. He says, quote, "We failed to see any popular movement for Protestantism, or the humble labour of missionary preaching with which the Christian faith was first planted in Europe. Professing a religion of freedom, the Protestants imposed their creed by the harsh exercise of civil power and by the prescription of what had been for centuries the religious birthright of the people." He goes on, he says, "The first feature to be noted, in which it is the ancestor of modern liberalism," which is where if you like, we could take the conversation to the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution and so forth. But what he says, in which it is the first ancestor of modern liberalism, is Protestantism's elitist character. it can be seen that a movement which appealed to the written word of Scripture in an age in which many were illiterate, right, this is the same argument that More makes, and which invoked scholars' interpretations of the Greek text to challenge traditional teaching, was essentially the work of a minority. Right? So what Sear is saying here is this notion that Protestantism is really dependent on a network of intelligentsia for the success of its mission. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. So, I've lost my page. It would be interesting to go on and just think for a second about More's view of the relationship between church and state. Because the chap I quoted yesterday, James McConaughey, the historian, and also there's Eamon Duffy, who is a historian who I have problems with in many ways. Are you familiar with his work? Stripping of the Altars. It's a good work. There are some problems, but it's a good work. I don't know if you've ever come across his History of the Popes. It's better not to read that. Sorry?
Any specific reason why?
Well, he very much runs with the thesis that the papacy is an invention of the post-Constantinian church, basically. So he wouldn't really agree that the papal lineage can be traced back to Peter, which is a problem because that's heresy. But he anyway, I mean, you can read it and see what you think. But
I did read it. I didn't get that impression.
But he's quite a good Reformation historian, and so James McConaughey and Duffy really look into the political thought of More and how he understands the relationship between church and state. And of course, it's quite interesting because England had not that long ago had to deal with Lollardy. And I don't know if you're familiar with Lollardy, but Lollardy was a movement in the late medieval period in England, which was it was a kind of precursor to the Reformation. So it really did not agree with the notion of a priestly hierarchy. It was iconoclastic. It held very strongly to the notion of one can receive the fullness of Christian revelation by an individual reading of Holy Scripture. And so in many ways, and Luther even saw this. I mean, he recognised that Lollardy was a precursor to the Reformation. He noted that during his lifetime. But it had caused a total disaster in England. It had been enormously divisive and eventually was suppressed. But it had caused such a problem in the country, the religious division, and therefore political division, that Henry V actually made it part of the unwritten constitution of these isles that anyone taking a political office had to swear an oath before God that he would use his civil authority to fight heresy, which is really interesting to take note of that that More had actually taken an oath when he had taken the office of Chancellor, that he would use his political authority to suppress heresy. But the justification that More predominantly seems to give for the state's defense of the church, if you can put it that way, he's particularly in the confutation of Tyndale's answer and in the dialogue concerning heresies, he emphasizes the place of the religion of the country for social cohesion. So what's clearly at the back of his mind is the relationship between cultus and culture, as it were. That the common religion of the people unites them so that they have a single identity. And it's interesting because More is very much looking to Europe and seeing how this manifests itself on the continent as well. And I think this explains things like he's right. It's interesting to me that a Londoner, is writing the Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation, where he's imagining a conversation between two Hungarian nobles preparing for a Turkic invasion. And throughout the work, it's very clear to him that their religion is the same as his religion. It's almost that the cultures of Europe are, you could say, they're not really different cultures, let's put it that way. They are different expressions of the same culture, if you want to put it that way. Because they all participate in this single Catholic cultus, as it were. Which is why, it's interesting, because in England now, we're very used to talking about the continent, sort of Europe over there, which we're kind of part of, but not really, and then the Anglosphere, which is really where we belong. And we're very used to kind of thinking in this way. But this is the notion of an Anglosphere is really a kind of Protestant ideal, Anglican idea that becomes realised through the empire. In the 18th and 19th centuries. More wouldn't have thought in these terms at all that England was something separate from Europe. England was completely, or Britain was completely European in its identity. And so he, which is why, of course, he constantly talks about the appeal to the universities throughout Europe and the saints throughout Europe. Well, of course, he uses the term Christendom. So he thinks of religion very much as being the primary principle in social cohesion, and therefore an attack on the cultus is an attack on the culture. And it's a way to tear apart a country. So, for More, he's sort of arguing, look, the state has to step in and defend the church for its own good. And you can see, because tragically we don't have these anymore, but More made a name for himself as a young scholar because he gave a series of public lectures in London on Augustine's City of God. We don't have these lectures anymore, which is very sad. But he clearly really studied the thought of Augustine, took it very seriously. And it seems to me he's familiar with Augustine's just war doctrine, which, it takes Aquinas later on to start thinking about just war doctrine in terms of states, fighting against states. For Augustine talks about just war doctrine in terms of a state dealing with heretics within its own jurisdiction. And More seems to be quite sort of sensitive to this, and develops Augustinian arguments on the defence of the church, the state's defence of the church for its own defence. And why this is interesting is because later we find that someone like Bellarmine doesn't really accept arguments like that. In fact, Bellarmine comes down very strongly on arguments of the church's defence, the state's defence of the church in order to defend civil stability. Because what Bellarmine wants to say is, no, the state does not defend the church for its own stability. The state should be prepared to risk stability to defend the church. And Bellarmine feels extremely uncomfortable with these kinds of arguments because they're arguments that could be used in order to, by Protestants actually. We will defend Protestantism because this is now a Protestant country predominantly, and for civic stability, that's what we need to do. Or by any religion. And Bellarmine says, well, no, this isn't how it works. The state has an obligation to defend the church because, for Bellarmine, it's the true religion. And having had the true religion preached to it and accepted that, it therefore has a moral obligation to defend that religion and the church, which is the guardian of it, for the salvation of its own citizenry. And therefore must be prepared to risk, even a civil war, total civil chaos, in defence of the true religion. Now, Bellarmine never mentions More by name, so I don't know if he's responding to More or to others who are making the same arguments. But I just thought I'd highlight this because it's kind of interesting. And it would be interesting to think about which position would lend itself more to the kind of hylomorphic conception of church-state relations that's coming out of Salamanca during that period. Any questions about that? Yeah.
What exactly is the Salamancan school?
Right, sorry. Salamanca is a university in Spain, surrounded by kind of semi-arid desert. And it's a very interesting place, particularly during that period, because they developed a type of pedagogy which, what would happen is the lecturer would walk in to an auditorium and they would turn over this great big water clock which would run for 90 minutes. And the lecturer in the morning would teach to the students for 90 minutes. And he would just sort of talk at them. And then when it ran out, they would all go for their siesta because it was getting too hot by that point. And then while they were sort of dozing around, they could think about the morning's lecture. And then the lecturer would come back and they would turn the water clock round again And for 90 minutes, he couldn't say anything that wasn't a response to a question. So they would be firing at him and challenging things that he had said all morning, and he would be desperately trying to respond to them in that period. So they developed this kind of quite interesting form of pedagogy in Salamanca. But that's by the by. It was a school of scholasticism. So it was a school of thinkers, predominantly Dominicans and Jesuits, although also there's a kind of codex or several manuals of what are called the Salamancan Carmelites, who were great scholastic thinkers, and those who have much better Latin than I do tell me that they're particularly worth reading. People like Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson, the scholastics of the 20th century, were very keen on the Salamancan Thomaists. And so in Spain developed this school of Thomistic thinking, which was particularly focused on ethical and political questions. And the three most important figures are Francisco de Vitoria, who was a Dominican, Domingo de Soto, who was a Jesuit, I think he was a Jesuit, and Francisco Suarez, who was also a Jesuit. And, De Soto worked a lot on economic questions as well, actually, but they're dealing a lot with political and ethical questions. And why they become particularly important is, particularly Vitoria, but also later thinkers, take on the cause of the indigenous in South America against the enslavers. And they argue for the humanity of, and for the political rights of the indigenous there. And they come up with really radical things, by the way. So, for example, unlike the Lutheran conception of civil authority, they're arguing absolutely that civil authority is natural authority, because the state is a natural society. And therefore, you can't go and start taking the land off the indigenous on the grounds that these are non-Christian barbarians. It really is irrelevant. These people have a natural authority which must be respected. And Vitoria goes so far as to say the chiefs or the chieftains of the jungles are just as much kings as the King of Spain. And what is shocking is that not only did he say these things, but the King of Spain made Vitoria his primary advisor on these issues. So he was taken really, really seriously. And in the end actually managed to bring about the ending of Spanish enslavement in South America. The Portuguese continued it, but it received a condemnation from the Spanish crown and from the papacy, interestingly. And a lot of this is based on the question of natural slavery. This is really what the issue is about here. Whether some people are slaves by nature. And interestingly enough, Vittoria argues for the freedom of the indigenous in South America precisely by upholding the principle of natural slavery. How? Well, we're going totally off topic, but it's so interesting. He says this: if people are slaves by nature, then according to the Aristotelian conception of that, they are not to be exploited, but they are meant to be ordered toward their proper finality. They can't order themselves toward it because they are defective in some way, but they need to be ordered toward their proper finality. And the appropriate place to be immediately ordered toward your proper human finality, as best you can be, according to your existential condition, the place appropriate for that is the domestic sphere. So if you are taking slaves and making them work in fields or whatever, this is not actually taking somebody and incorporating them into a family and treating them like one of the children of the family, which is exactly what Aristotle proposes for natural slaves, that they need to subsist within the domestic sphere for their own good, and they need to be treated with a kind of love and order toward their finality. He also thinks that if you do believe in natural slavery, you can't both believe in natural slavery and believe in slave trading. Because what slave trading precisely doesn't do is discriminate between who are and who are not natural slaves. So he also thinks that if it was even possible to have a whole population of natural slaves, which Vittoria doesn't really think that's possible, but he says even if it was possible, there are certain things that you would expect not to see, like, for example, art or music, right, which the indigenous had, or architecture, or political hierarchy. All of these presuppose quite advanced rationality. So what Vittoria ends up saying is, okay, fine, maybe you do want to argue for the slave trade, but you can't argue for it on the grounds of natural slavery. In fact, natural slavery is not in your favour here. It's genius, actually. I mean, really, really brilliant. Yeah.
Does he ever comment on whether or not Christians can enslave Turks, Muslims who don't accept the faith?
Yes, he says you can't. He says you can't. He says you can fight them and you can conquer them and you can preach to them and you can try and get people to accept baptism. But the thing is, for Vittoria, and it is helpful actually, because what I want to say is that this is the most influential political school in the 16th century and in the late 15th century. And it is proposing a political and ethical vision completely at odds with that being proposed by the Lutherans and by the Protestants. And this is the one that gets accepted in the Catholic Church predominantly throughout Christendom. So it is quite important. And what Vittoria really, really is insisting upon is that nature is not corrupt. It is wounded, but it is not corrupt. And therefore you can have real natural societies and real natural authority, and that supernatural societies and supernatural authority cannot override the natural rights of those natural societies. It can merely, you could say, it is presupposed by them. And this is why, for example, that Vittoria, I wish I brought my paper on this, because there are some good quotes about this, but Vittoria, for example, thinks that he argues very strongly against the idea of baptizing a child without the permission of the parents, for example. He thinks that okay, it doesn't matter that this is good for the child, particularly if the child is then taken away and raised as a Christian and can fulfill all of the obligations placed on it by the baptism in the first place, right? It doesn't actually matter. The very fact that you're using supernatural reasons to violate natural rights is completely unacceptable. It's amazing.
Because there is natural authority.
Yeah.
Does he argue that, this is what you're saying, is that he says that because of that, Christian authority, therefore, doesn't have authority over other forms of natural authority? For instance, that because the Christians show up on the shores of South America, because they have Christian authority, which comes from supernatural authority, they can't impose that authority on the indigenous people.
It depends what you mean by imposition. What he thinks is that the Christian missionaries have a supernatural right to announce the gospel. Okay? They can preach to the indigenous. What they can't do, the church cannot employ the secular arm, that is to say a natural authority, to coerce another natural authority into accepting supernatural doctrines. Okay? So what the church can't do is come, announce the gospel, guess what, great news, God incarnated, saved us all, it's wonderful. For the indigenous to say, we don't believe you, and for the missionaries to then say, that's okay, we've got an army to make you believe, right? He says this is a completely illegitimate way of furthering the gospel. But the point is here, which I think actually it's really helpful that we came onto this, because what you're getting a sense of is that the church ends up quite organically proposing a political and ethical conception and a way of human flourishing and human living that is completely and utterly at odds with the Lutheran or the Protestant conception, which, as you know, develops into this kind of Leviathan idea of the polity. And they do it by, in a certain sense, retrieving the original Christian conception of nature. They say, no, nature isn't totally corrupt, and it's not just not totally corrupt, but if you accept these premises, all of this follows from it. And what's interesting is today, we think that all of the conclusions of these kinds of thinkers were actually really good. Like, I think most people, if you ask them on the street about the abolition of slave trading and things, they would feel pretty comfortable with this. So, you know, this is the and of course it's interesting that the great proponents of slave trading later on are the Dutch and the Protestant countries, not the Catholic countries. They kind of dealt with this at its origins, as it were. The Portuguese were slightly more mischievous. So, you should have said that to me well. Any other questions? Oh yeah, sorry.
So I came with it, so it's maybe some that's important on. But how did the language of rights get into the conversation? Because I'm obviously, when I hear rights, I think of more modern conception of the whole affair. So I'm just curious as to how that sort of came part of the conversation.
Rights. Okay, rights. human rights, natural rights, and so on. Yeah, I was really interested in this when I started looking into. It's really the Salamancan school that first starts really pushing for this notion of rights. But they have a conception of rights that are positive rights. Okay. So what I mean by that is their conception of rights presupposes a positive conception of liberty. So rights are those things that enable you to do certain things. And the things that they enable you to do are those things that you are bound to by duty. Okay? So they will say things like, if you have a baptized child, you have a right to instruct that child in the faith. Why? Because you have a moral power that enables you to fulfill a duty. Right? This is where the first distinction that they bring up is the distinction between a right and a might. Yeah? If you have a might, you have a physical power which enables you to do things. Right? If you have a right, you have a moral power which enables you to do things. And those things, whether it's a right or a might, that's meant to facilitate you doing the thing that you're supposed to do. Right? So now when we talk about rights, we tend to talk about rights with a negative, in the negative sense, which, you might disagree. I get the sense that this is slightly more a kind of Americanist conception of rights, that you have a right to be left alone, you have a right to be free from things, to be, I don't know if you would totally buy that, you could argue with me, but that's the sense I get from the more kind of, whereas, I suppose just very quickly, a negative conception of liberty presupposes a view that freedom is arbitrarily ordered. Okay, so you choose what makes you happy, what's good for you, and then you've got to argue that you have the kind of rights that free you from the limitations that prevent you from doing those things. Whereas the Salamancans would never subscribe to an idea of liberty. They think that there's an objective human good toward which we should be ordered, and the polity and the family and so forth and the church should help us in being ordered toward that. And that once you identify those things that you are duty-bound to follow, you must argue for your right to fulfill those duties. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
We've got 5 more minutes. We can finish earlier, or if you've got any burning questions. Any questions? Yeah.
I actually did want to ask, just going back to your point about Moore and Bellarmine and the kind of disagreement between them. I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I was wondering about whether they would actually disagree if they could have discussed with each other.
Yeah.
Just because Moore is such a prudential man, and everything he says is so much in consideration of his circumstances.
Yes. When Moore is proposing his position on things, you can see he's constantly, as you say, he's prudentially trying to gauge what's the most appropriate thing in the circumstances he's in. Bellarmine has the freedom not to do that because he's an abstract scholastic thinker. He's, but it does surprise me that, for example, the early Moore, when he is dealing with heresy in the country with the full support of his king and so forth, he's still arguing predominantly from, he never uses this term, social cohesion, but it's a way of summarising his position. He's still arguing predominantly from the principle of social cohesion. he's saying, he's saying to the king, and he's saying as the mouthpiece of the king, this is really bad for the country. In a way, he's thinking like a politician, and he's thinking in relation to the oath we saw. Right? This is really bad for the country. This is really bad for the people. This is going to pit brother against brother, sister against sister. This is really politically disastrous, and we have to deal with it, and we need to deal with it quickly. And I'm sure if Bellarmine said, well, hold on a minute, wouldn't you even risk civil stability for... actually, I just don't know. I really don't know. I don't know whether he would have, or he would have said, no, I think that's a really bad plan, actually. But Bellarmine is sensitive to the fact that the majority of the arguments for suppressing heresy are similar to More's arguments, and he doesn't like it. And I found that fascinating when I came across it. And I think it's. I just want to say I think it's really healthy when we find instances of saints disagreeing, right? Because it enables us to say, okay, well, there's diversity of opinion here. We can try and work it out. We can argue it through. And this comes up time and time again. A very good example with Bellarmine, by the way, which isn't a political thing, but Bellarmine's. Bellarmine has. Have you ever heard of the destruction theory of the Mass, the Holy Mass? No. So this is totally novel, right? In the 16th century, arguments developed over when exactly when the words of consecration are said. Is it when the priest holds up the host? Right. Well, that wasn't even introduced into the liturgy until Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury under William I, introduced it. Right? There was no elevation until then. So that probably not that, right? So they're trying to argue out when the actual sacrifice takes place. Now, actually, these arguments had arisen before, and Gregory Nazianzen had written quite a lot about this early on in the church. He insisted that the moment of sacrifice took place at the altar at the moment of the consecration. Right, when the words, he has a wonderful phrase, he says, with the words of consecration, the priest sacrifices the victim with unbloody cut, he says. So it's a wonderful phrase. So these questions had come up before. Bellarmine argues for a view of the consecration, which is not only completely novel, but was explicitly rejected by Pius XII much later on, that the sacrifice takes place when the priest consumes the host. And he calls it the destruction conception. So as the teeth come down on the host, that's the sacrificing of the victim. Look, he's wrong. Bellarmine's just wrong about this, and we accept that he's wrong about this. But it's good when saints are wrong, because it means that we can argue about it, and that's a good thing. So that's my parting message to you. It's good when the saints are wrong. All right. Well, look, thank you very much indeed. If you have any other questions or anything, maybe I'll be around for the rest of the day, so just come and talk to me. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.